So good to be here. If you would open your Bibles to 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, I want to make a few personal comments and then we'll jump into the lesson. But 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 2, Paul writes, "We give thanks to God always for you all, making mention of you in our prayers, remembering without ceasing your work of faith, labor of love, and patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the sight of our God and Father, knowing, beloved, your election by God." I appreciate this congregation so much. I appreciate your faith, as Paul mentions here, your labor of love, your service, your devotion through the years. Of course, our relationship goes back quite a while, and I have to say that coming here and being invited to be here, it is a blessing. It's an honor to be able to return and to be with you for a few days to study God's Word together. And it's really like coming home to family. I mean, we just come in here together and talk just like, no time has passed, like we saw each other just a few days ago. And that means so much to me. And that means a lot to my family. And by the way, concerning family, Hannah has not had her baby yet. For those of you who may not know, my daughter's pregnant. She and her husband are expecting. It is due Saturday, and I am hoping that it's all wrapped up and done by the time I get back. But so I appreciate your prayers on her behalf. But I've been praying for this meeting since John had reached out and asked that I might be able to come this week. Been praying for it. I know you've been praying for it. And it's our prayer that we can do some good in the kingdom this week together. I'm deeply grateful for my time here in the past. It's such a blessing. After you get away from maybe something you've been involved in and you get a little more perspective on things, being in Newton, it's a blessing down in North Carolina and things are going well, but you also get perspective on things that you had been blessed to be a part of before. So I want to thank you for your kindness, your patience with me in the past, the forgiveness that you have extended to me at times, and I want to say that I benefited much more by being here than I think you benefited. That wasn't supposed to happen. But I do appreciate you so much. I appreciate Ron for his steadfast devotion to teaching the gospel, being an encouragement, being a great example of somebody who's energetic and enthusiastic in laboring in the gospel. And I appreciate the elders. And sorry, Craig and Ross, I'm going to leave you out of this just for a second. But for Tom and Layman and John, and the time that I was here working and laboring as one of the preachers, you guys were a great blessing to me, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to learn and to serve and to grow in my work and labor. And I appreciate y'all's steadfastness, your steadiness, and your determination that this congregation would be what the Lord would have it to be, and people would be living right before the Lord. And so I appreciate y'all very much. I appreciate the congregation as a whole, each member. So many good relationships that we've had and continue to have with the brethren who are here. So I love and appreciate y'all very much. Let's get to Daniel chapter 1 now. Daniel chapter 1. And I do want to do this as a Bible class, so I'm going to ask some folks to read at times as we go through this. I'm going to ask questions and hope to get some feedback. And if you are one who reads, please speak out very loudly so that everyone is able to hear well as we go through this study together. But I would like to start down in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 18 and just follow along with me for a moment here. It says, "Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. You know, in this first chapter in the book of Daniel, we read about 4 Jewish youths who found themselves at the center of world power, serving a king who had conquered their homeland. And as they are being brought into service here, as it talks about them being interviewed and how they were found, and they were excellent, that they had an incredible opportunity here that very few people in the world ever would have had or ever have had. So it's very unique. And the question may be, you know, how did they get here? How did they get to the center of power of the world at that time? If you step back and look at a bigger picture, Daniel chapters 1 through 6, you see here how the remnant of God's people could and did remain faithful even in captivity. And it highlights these 4 Jewish young men starting when they were quite young. They're no longer, of course, in the promised land, in that land of milk and honey. The place where they grew up, where their parents grew up, where they lived, where they existed for generations. They're no longer in that familiar. And they're no longer surrounded by fellow Israelites. That is the idea that even in Judah, as bad as it was, there were still at least believers in Jehovah. There was a even though that may not have been the case as a whole. And so they're not surrounded by believe in Jehovah. They're in a foreign land, in a foreign culture. They're surrounded by paganism. But by personal resolve and God's providential care, each could make decisions and take actions that honored God. And we see that play out here, especially in these first 6 chapters. They faced risk as they did this. As they're in this new environment, they're going through these new experiences, surrounded by different people. They face various troubles, threats, even threats against their life at times. But they were ones who were determined that they were going to serve God. And Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were young when they were carried away into Babylon. They weren't mature. They weren't like an Elijah, say in 1 Kings 17, a mature prophet that goes toe-to-toe in the next chapter, chapter 18, with the prophets of Baal. They weren't like Moses, who was really called to serve God at 80 years old. These are teenage boys who are taken away and put into a completely new environment. And if you were to not know the end of the story, you may wonder, will they survive with their faith intact? Will they get through this experience? Are they going to collapse under the pressure? Are they going to lose heart? You know, imagine being taken away from a somewhat dilapidated Jerusalem, and things were not going well there, and they are transported over to a highly advanced civilization. And they get to Babylon. It was advanced in art and literature and science. The city was well designed and well laid out. It's filled with modern buildings and temples there. There's a lot of splendor, a lot of luxury. There's a lot of commerce, a lot of wealth. And so they're taken from sort of the run-down area over to this area that just had to be overwhelming to them as they went in and they saw it and they experienced everything that was around them. But we go to Daniel chapter 1, Daniel 1, and let's read here verses 1 through 5 as it begins to unfold for us how they got where they were and then how they end up in the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel 1, 1 through 5. Can I get a volunteer to read that? Just indicate, let me know. Go ahead, Nathan.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the
So Daniel and his friends are carried away in this first wave of captivity. It's around 606, 605 BC. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And they went into captivity for what reason? Why does God take them from that land of milk and honey over to this land of people of a foreign language?
Because they had fallen away from God, and it was just God's way of judging them.
Yeah, exactly right. God was judging the nation of Judah, and he's also taking these who are faithful out, and they're being really preserved and protected in this land of Babylon. But you wouldn't think that as, like you're living here, somebody swept through and plucked you out. Oh, this is a good thing. We would think, no, it's a bad thing. Bob?
There's also prophecy.
Yes. Yes, exactly right. And Moses had foretold, here's what you're going to go through. Here's what you'll experience if you turn against God. And so you'll be scattered among the nations. So, yeah, exactly right. Now, it mentions that Jehoiakim is king of Judah there in verse 1 at this time when it happens. And if you go back and read through the accounts, you understand that Jehoiakim had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He's taken captive, or Jehoiakim is taken captive. And then he ends up, though, reigning for a total of 11 years. But he was not a good king, as so many of them were not. And the Babylonian king, when he goes in, he pulls out these captives. And from among these captives, those, it says here, that are of the royal line and of noble line. And he absorbs them into his kingdom. And notice in verse 4, this standard that they use. What is the standard? What are some of the things it mentions about? Here's how they selected the young men to come and get into this program, so to speak.
Well, there was an outward appearance that was important. Good looking, no blemish, so they wanted somebody who had a good representation outwardly, for one thing.
Okay. Has that changed in our world?
Not much.
Let's be honest. People who are in the political spotlight, they're within a certain range of how they look. There are some people that can't get elected because they just don't fit that kind of polished profile, if you will. They're not good looking enough. Because today there's so much to deal with the cameras and things. And so that's an outward thing that people have valued. Now, we understand wrongly valued, but that's something that was there. And so these young men are good-looking young men. They look fit, they look healthy, and so let's get them in. There's no blemish, no physical defects. They're not like, missing an eye, or their one arm is shorter than the other. They're healthy specimens, if you will. And it talks about what other aspect of them. After it talks about, no blemish, they're good looking.
They're skilled and they're talented.
Okay, they have a certain amount of intelligence and skill and learning that's already in place. They have been educated so that they're not starting from scratch with these young men. They've already had a certain amount of education in their life, and they are quick learners. And it also says there that they have an ability, verse 4, to serve in the king's palace. What do you think that's pointing toward? They have the ability to serve in the king's palace.
Well, it could be that they already have some knowledge of what that's like. If
Okay.
they're descendants from the king, they're already in touch with what that's like. They're not just common people who have no idea.
Right. Mike.
Willing to submit.
They're willing. Okay. And you can see that in here, and you see the tension between submitting to one authority versus the other. We'll talk more about that later. But they're not fools. They know how to properly conduct themselves. To John's point, these guys are descendants of kings and of noble people, and they have a decorum about them. They can be counted on. You come into the king and you're serving the king, and the king's advisors are around, and these foreign people are coming in. These guys aren't going to embarrass us. They understand how to conduct themselves around other people. He's doing great. So they're discreet, they are sober-minded young men, they're intelligent, they're good-looking, and they have this ability to be taught. It even talks about, the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. So they have to be trained to know the proper protocols and everything else dealing with the Babylonian court. And they're in training for this 3-year program. One of the sources I saw said they usually started these young men around 14 years of age in doing this. So I'm going to take it, Daniel and his friends are roughly around that age. We're not given that, but somewhere right around that age. And they're in there to be trained to serve in the king's court, as we said. Now, it included this special diet. We're going to get to the application of it in just a little bit, but there is a special diet that they're given. So let's now read verses 6 through 16. If somebody wants to take a little longer reading, 6 through 16, who will grab that? Go ahead, Will.
Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, nor with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, from whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food to be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave to them vegetables.
All right. So Daniel and his friends were determined to live by God's standard. And one of the things it says, though, that's interesting to me is their names are changed. Now, each one of them, Daniel and the others, and Daniel's name is my judge is God, and the others, their names are related to Jehovah. But they have their names changed. Now, the question is, why were their names changed?
Well, the Babylonians didn't just take these young nobles from Israel for fun or to help out these young nobles. This was a form of policing among the nations that they controlled. This is a large empire. The Chaldeans had a lot of different areas under their control, a lot of different cultures. So they would take the nobles, the sons of kings, bring them into the center of their power, teach them their culture, teach them their language, and hope that they would pay a little loyalty to the area that's above them. And it's also, I think, changing these names is a way of saying, we're in control of you. We're the ones here. We're the ones that we took you from your home. You answer to us. We're going to change your name, and you're going to be happy with that.
Yeah. So there is an aspect of basically we have authority over you. And we're the ones that determine how you are identified. It can also serve the purpose of fitting into the government and being able to be there. Maybe easier to pronounce for the people who are there. How many of us have called up customer service and you know it's somebody in India, but his name is Bob? Your name is not Bob. I know it's not Bob, but that's what they pick because it identifies with us as we're on the phone with them. So there may be some aspect of that helps out, but they are being given these names that are related to the Babylonian gods, and this is a way to give them a new identity to think about themselves. I mean, you think about Jacob being called Israel, or Abram being called Abraham. It was, in part, the name that we have is how we identify ourselves. And names are very important in that aspect. To who do you see yourself as? And so they're being given this, to Matthew's point. You are now a part of our government, a part of our culture. They're trying to bring them into that. So their names are changed, but beginning in verse 8, we see their hearts weren't changed. You could change that name. You can call them whatever you want to call them, but that doesn't mean they're different. They were still the same young men as when they were pulled from Judah and transported all the way over to Babylon. And it says that Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself with this diet. That defile is, of course, the idea of to soil, to pollute in some way. So he saw what was being offered to him and his friends to eat. That's going to pollute us. And it's not talking about it's going to pollute our physical body, and this is a bad diet, it's high fat, high carb, or whatever they would have dealt with back then. It's not a dietary, health-oriented thing. And I think sometimes when people look back to the Old Testament, they say, well, God told them not to eat pork because of health reasons. That's not the reason God didn't tell them. He told them you can't eat pork. Distinguish between holy and unholy. That was a principle being laid down. And here they have been raised to understand that principle. They know what God's law says. And so Daniel says, we're not going to eat that. I'm not going to defile myself. And so they weren't going to violate the law of Moses and end up condemning themselves before the Lord. And so notice who he goes to first of all. It says in verse 9 that God brought Daniel into favor of the goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And so verse 10, the chief of the eunuchs, he's appealed to him for help. But what's the initial answer?
No, basically.
No, I'm not going to do it. I fear my Lord. You know that this program they have, including the diet that they're served, was not done on a whim. And they didn't change it from one group to another. This is something they figured out. Here's the best way to run this operation, and here's how we're going to take care of these young men. Here's the education program, the physical regimen, the diet that they're served, the clothes that they wear. You know it's going to be all wrapped up in that. And so he's like, I am not going to do that. So verse 11, what does Daniel do? Well, you got this chief of the eunuchs, who's, I take it as he's over the whole program, and this steward is the immediate supervisor of Daniel and them. And Daniel goes to him, hey, he told me no, well, I'm going to go to this guy. What's he going to say? And he convinces him to do that. Says, test us 10 days, all of that. They saw the results. It looked good. So they're good to go from that point on. But Daniel and his friends, they are better off at the end of this. So verse 17 then, and we'll get to some application here in a second. Let's read 17 to 21 and kind of wrap up the overview. Go ahead, Brian.
As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all manners of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus.
All right, so God is with them and blessing them. It says knowledge and skill, wisdom, literature, all those things. Daniel had understanding, visions, dreams. So God is working with them. He's watching over them. He's blessing them to be in this position, to be able to serve in these roles and do a good job. But that's not separate and apart from their own personal determination and work and labor. I mean, when it talks about they had to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans, they actually had to study that. It wasn't like they were just infused with it. They had to actually study it and work through it and learn it and do all those things. So they're there doing their part. God is working with them and blessing them in that. And when they're interviewed, the king doesn't find anybody else like them. In fact, they're so good. Verse 20 makes note of something. It jumps out to me. Who else are they better than? Not just their peers that are in the program.
Those that are already established in the Chaldean court.
Yeah, those men that have been there maybe decades. These young guys are smarter. They're better off. They handle themselves better than the rest of them do. All right, so some lessons that I think we can draw out of this. And the first one is to appreciate godly youth. Young people who are oriented to God, loving God, serving God, and doing His will in their life. You know, we live in a time where there are some hopeful signs out there in the world that there are young people, you see some things where they're becoming more religious, they're turning to Jesus, but it's a very generic way. But just the idea that there are people who recognize we need God in our life. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes people think, well, young people, they're just not really ready, they're not equipped to serve God, you know, over the years, and maybe when they're in their 20s, when they're in their 30s, when they're in their 40s, they'll serve God. And sometimes young people think, well, I'll serve God later. Well, here's an example of young men, teenagers, that are serving God, and they're committed to doing His will. And Daniel and his friends are good examples, really, for all of us, but especially for the youth. Let me ask you this. Do you think this program of training was only filled with Jewish youth?
No, not likely.
So who would some of their peers be?
Well, it actually would have been probably some of Israel's own enemies around them. You would have had, groups that really they had interacted with all that time.
Okay, so you think about the fact that some of the other young men, and I don't know if this is like 15, 20, 50, 100 going through. We just get these 4 because that's the focus. But there's a larger group who are being trained. And really in any situation like this, so that I would liken this kind of to the military. So the military, when they recruit people, they bring them in large batches, and they run them through, and they generally recruit more than they actually need. That's the idea, because they know some are going to fall out along the way. Some are just not going to cut it. They're not going to make it for whatever reason. It's just not going to happen. So I'm going to assume that is a similar thing, but just the idea is you got these 4, and there are others there who are pagan, who have a completely different standard. They don't understand Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and what they're about and why they are the way they are, and vice versa. So they have others around them, but they're not being influenced to just conform, to be like the rest of the guys around them. And you can imagine how stressful that can be at times, because they're expected to perform, they're expected to do well, they're expected to be a part of the government and this program, and to play along and get along. That's what's expected of them. So there's pressure there, but they're not influenced to give in and to fit in. That is, they don't give in to that influence. And so they don't give in to pressure to simply please their master's John.
And don't know where all you're gonna go with this, but I would have to think that they did not accidentally come to this ability to stand out and stand up. Parents somewhere fell in line there, they had to, because you made a statement, most of Israel, Judah, was corrupt, except for a few, and so, I mean, they did not just accidentally, that didn't accidentally happen.
Bingo. Let's go to Ephesians 6. Ephesians chapter 6. You know, young people can set a great example for people around them. They can be an influence for good, for righteousness, for truth. And as John said, that's not by accident. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, when they showed up over in Babylon, they didn't make up their mind when they got there all of a sudden, hey, we're going to believe in Jehovah, we're going to do Jehovah's will, we're going to eat special diets and, you know, buck the system. That's not when they made up their mind. They made up their mind long before they got there, and the reason they were able to do that is because they had been raised right. They had been taught. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, let me get somebody to read that for us. Just remind us what it says. Go ahead, Doug.
It says, "And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture of the training, discipline, and the admonition of the Lord."
Okay. So this admonition given to fathers specifically, raise your children in the Lord. What is it to raise your children in the Lord, up in the training and admonition of the Lord? What does that look like?
Saturate them with God's word and God's will.
Okay. Do you think Daniel and his friends and their parents had sat down and taught them about the law? Do you think they were taken to the temple and they were there for the reading of the law if it was happening on any occasion? But they have been instilled with the law of Moses. They know it. They know what it says. In spite of the fact that they've been transported hundreds of miles away from home, they're not in the holy city of Jerusalem, they're over in this pagan capital. They know what it says.
And I say they also saw their own parents doing the things that they were teaching their children to do.
Yes, exactly right. They had to have had this tremendous foundation to be able to go over here, be brought into this government, surrounded by all these, ungodly influences, but stand fast in that. Let's go to 2 Timothy, please. 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy 1. And notice here verse 5. 2 Timothy 1:5. Craig, do you want to read that for us?
When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded that it is thee also.
All right. So, is there anything interesting about what Paul mentions there regarding Timothy?
His mother and his grandmother were a great influence on him being godly.
Who was not?
His father.
His father was not. And it's interesting, Ephesians 6, 4 fathers, and here, father's absent, because his father's agreed, because, the book of Acts talks about. But even in the absence of a father who should be discharging his duty, grandmothers and mothers can have a tremendous impact upon the young people who are being raised up and taught by their example, by their teaching, their encouragement, by taking them to assemble with saints. So there's a great place for both grandparents and parents. Now, parents are charged with raising their children. We understand that. But a grandparent can have a great influence over the grandchild in teaching them and helping them to know the will and the Word of God. But, of course, they need to be living that themselves and showing that example, showing true commitment to the Lord. Now, over in chapter 3, 2 Timothy chapter 3, 14 and 15, Remember, it says there that, you need to continue the things you have learned, been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. From childhood, what does that mean? Let me ask some of you. When did you start reading and talking to your children about God, the Word of God? Day one?
Before they could understand it.
Okay, before they can understand it. Yeah. And I'll just tell you, a little baby in the womb hears. And a little baby, when it's in its mother's womb and it comes to services, it can hear the singing. It can hear what's being spoken. Okay, there's a point at which they do hear. They're familiar with their father and mother's voices when they are born. So we need to understand from childhood, from day one, we need to be teaching to them, talking to them, helping to familiarize them with and orient their mind toward God, toward His Word, worshiping God, serving God, honoring God. And it can have an impact. It will have an influence. Because those things that we're talking about around them, it's sinking in. Reading the Bible to them, it's sinking in. It's in that mind. That's the way God designed the mind. It's in there. And so when we do that, I want young people to understand, if your parents, and even if it's just one of your parents, but if you have a parent or both parents that are faithful and committed to the Lord, you have a blessing like no other. They're going to give you a life and a foundation for stability, making wise choices in life, avoiding dangers and hardships and troubles. They're going to give you strength and conviction that when you come to that moment of decision, it's not hard for you. Daniel and his friends came to a moment of decision. Here the king is, we're in a special privileged place. We're not back there in Judah and suffering. We're over here and we are living a grand life compared to so many others. And look at where we're going to be day in and day out in the king's court. We're going to be dressed. We're going to be clothed. We're going to be educated. We've got all these things. And then that moment of decision came. Here's the food. I don't want to eat that food. No, I can't do anything about that. Hey, can you help us out here? Give us a different diet. Just test us on it. Okay, we'll do that. That decision was made long before they ever got there in reality. John?
I think about how we prayed, like even before this class, that we would hear the things and make the application. Okay, well that's the thing. Our children can hear a lot of things, they can hear the truth, but to make the application, we have to help them as we go through our lives and situations occur. Help them to understand, okay, now this is the application. I have a grandson whose favorite word when he was real little was why. Why? And that's a good question. And so we give them an understanding, an application. And that's what it said in Deuteronomy chapter 6. When you walk with them in the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, you give them application of what they're learning.
Exactly. And young people need to look at this. This is a blessing. This isn't a restriction. This isn't a tedious thing in my life. I am being prepared to go out and live a good life. Because there is no life that's better. There is no life, I want to say, that's gooder. That's better than being a Christian. Knowing who you are, what you're about, why you're on this earth, what's ahead of you, what promises there are. So there's nothing better, and young people whose parents and grandparents are helping them to learn and grow in the Lord, they need to appreciate that, because there are some people who don't have that, and their life is a wreck, it's a mess, and there's great heartache and sorrow in it. Paul and then Doug.
There's a saying among parents to their kids when they leave the house: remember who you are when you leave, right? Don't know that Daniel said that. They left the house. They left the country.
Yes, yes, it's manifest in a concrete way in their lives, exactly right. Doug, I think?
Just one thing in verse 8, back in Daniel, is talked about, he said that he purposed in his heart not to defile himself. He had prepared himself, and you've already talked about that. We need to spend, all ages need to spend some time thinking about, when we're faced with X, Y, Z, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? How am I going to react? We need to spend some time doing that in our private time.
Okay. To his point there, Daniel 1 verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart. What's another way to say purposed? Made up his mind. You know, people overcomplicate what it is to serve God. It's a decision. That's all it is. It's a decision. I've decided this is what I'm going to do. It's just a matter of the mind. I'm going to serve God. And so, whatever situation you face, whatever trial, whatever temptation, I'm going to serve God. It's as simple as that. I've made a decision. Choose you this day whom you will serve. What's he saying? Make a decision. Elijah on the Mount Carmel. You know, how long are you going to falter between two opinions? Jehovah's God, serve him. Baal's God, serve him. Make up your mind. Are you going to serve him or are you not going to serve him? Daniel and his friends have made up their mind, we're going to serve God. Ron?
I was just going to mention that sometimes young people off in college or in training or maybe a new job, and they feel under such a tremendous pressure, they feel intimidated not to speak up. Daniel spoke up and some accommodation was made. We need to realize if you'll speak up, it doesn't work 100% of the time, but very often it does work. Speak up for your faith and they'll make some kind of accommodation.
Exactly. You remain resolved. Because initially he faced resistance from the chief of the eunuchs. Then he goes to the steward, and the steward says, okay, we'll try this out. I'll do that for you. So you don't know what people will do until you put it out there, you ask for it, and you keep a little bit of pressure on them. That's one of the things that young people, maybe they lack a little confidence sometimes. Daniel doesn't seem to lack confidence, but sometimes they lack confidence because I don't know, is this going to work? Is this not going to work? You would be amazed at how people will respond to you when they see you're convicted, when you're serious. They will respect that over time. And those who don't, you may face some challenges with that, but you will appreciate the fact when you stick to your guns and you don't compromise and you don't give in, it will give you greater confidence down the road. But it's just simply a matter of making this decision and remaining resolved. It's difficult to change an environment when you go into it, but it can be done, to Ron's point. Matthew?
Kind of following Ron's point as well, especially I think, being in college or going to college, and there is an adversarial attitude to Christians within those institutions. Same here with Daniel. We can get to our own reasoning that, well, if I bend a little bit, it'll be better for me. Or taking in Daniel's situation, if I bend a little bit towards the Chaldeans and what they want, maybe they'll be better towards my home. They have brought me here. We talked about Jerusalem was in shambles. Well, if Daniel and those brought, well, if I appease the king or if I appease those ahead of me, maybe they'll help. Maybe they'll send stuff back home. But a lot of our times, our own reasoning or understanding is not sufficient. And that's why we're called to not lean on it. And tell that Daniel's purpose not just to do what was right, but also not to reason out of doing what was right.
Right. And so, young people, you'd be amazed, like if you're playing on a ball team, and I know there's some here who have done that you say, hey, I'm leaving at halftime because I'm going to church. You know what? Sometimes they may not be happy about that. And you just got to deal with whatever happens. But you will not regret it later. I know, there are people, I got a business trip. Well, can we push that a week? Because I got a gospel meeting going on that week, and I really need to be here. Those types of things can be done, and we need to be willing to do it, whether we're younger or older, to serve God and to honor God, and trusting God's working in these things. And you never know, as it happened here with Daniel, And as Paul writes, you know, he can do above all that we ask or think. Not only are they allowed to eat a different diet, but they are excelling above all their peers. You know, this does well for them at this point. All right, so we need to close it out there. Appreciate everybody's input and participation in it, and looking forward to our further studies.